All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We are presenting on third-party vendor risk assessments, which has been a big topic for us, both from our assessments as well as what we have to deal with ourselves. For anyone that missed it, or if you have to jump early, the webinar is being recorded and will be sent out in an email and also available on our website. First, a little background on TrustedSec. Our mission really is to change the security industry for the better. One of the ways we do that is support our customers by supplying free tools and tactics, information, calls, and support if you're struggling with a particular issue, for example. It's amazing that we have almost 50 consultants now, and almost without question, someone will know the answer or at least be able to point you in the right direction. So we're always here for you. Feel free at any time to call us or email us a question. No problem at all. We'll always be there to help you. Here are the various areas that we can help with if you haven't seen it in a little while. A couple of things that are new. Obviously, we'll be talking a lot today with practice lead for GRC and some of the services that we have under program assessment and compliance. We've also started up a remediation arm in the last within this year to really help customers with a lot of those times there's just short-term things that you need to get done, or you need someone who just has expertise. So we're able to provide that for you as well. When a lot of times when if you know what you're doing, it takes 3 hours. If you don't, it takes 3 weeks. So we found that as a big important area for our clients, and we're looking to help with that. So what we try to do is, start off really with the most challenging area of security, and that's understanding the real world effectiveness of security controls. So we've invested heavily in cutting edge research, and it really makes a tremendous difference in the value that you receive, because we're looking at all the attack vectors, ways that people are looking to come after you. So when we build this in all along throughout this life cycle, we can help you build your security program, test it, of course, grow it, and then also see if there's any incident response, help you respond to those types of things. So we're always there to help with that. Next, I want to introduce Alex Hamerstone. He is the practice lead of GRC, and give a little bit background. It's an absolute pleasure to work with Alex every day. He's been on TV so much in the last 6 months, as well as the keynote of several conferences, so you may have seen him in some of those areas. Alex?
Hi there, everybody. Very glad that you're joining us. So again, my name is Alex Hamerstone. I work on the GRC and advisory side here at TrustedSec. And one of the things in my past 6 years at TrustedSec, as well as in previous lives and consulting before that, is I spent a lot of time on both sides of the third-party risk assessment world. So both being assessed and realizing just how much time that takes to respond to these client questionnaires, but also on this side, helping organizations, be ready for them, and even working with organizations to go out and assess their vendors. So, we've seen a lot, and hopefully we'll provide some of that experience and value during this webinar.
Thanks. And again, my name is Stephen Marchewitz. I'm Director of Practice Development here. I've been in security and IT for quite a while now. Been on various aspects of it, helped build up risk management, advisory services in past lives, etc. Help with a lot with the business on digital transformation and aligning security all along that sort of supply chain and that integration. A lot of times what we're looking to do, I've been, tasked with answering a lot of the vendor questionnaires. So maybe even some of you within your teams or groups, I'm answering those. So especially this year, it's been pretty significant. So have a lot of insight and some practices on lessons learned that I have. So again, let's get started with what we're talking about. As we started, and the big reason for this right now was because we were hit with so many third-party requests just this year. Last year, we had maybe 3 to 5 tops, and this year we've had over 25, maybe 30 already. So it's been pretty significant change. And in reviews in many of the organizations, large and small, there was frustrations on all sides. Security teams are being overwhelmed with requests, and I think probably that's why a lot of us are here. auditors are being put in difficult situations. So a lot of times when we're talking to auditors, they haven't been trained in security. They're really asking questions that are, which I'll talk about in a second, which are outside of their area of expertise, and some things, quite frankly, don't even make sense. Small and medium businesses are diverting budget from other high impact security initiatives because there's so much of this time. Ponemon, there's a study, Ponemon estimates that third parties can spend up to 15,000 hours a year on completing assessments for the customers and prospects even. And so that's probably even worse if the customers and prospects, you don't even have the business. They're not even customers yet. You don't even have the business. So we're seeing it from, from all aspects, legal departments, et cetera.
And I think one thing I would add to that too is, also salespeople, I think, have a lot of frustrations with this when they're out selling solutions, and the clients they're working with, their potential clients, want these answers, and the salespeople don't always have them. And so they can have some frustration, trying to get those answers to provide to the potential clients and make sure that they're the right answers and things like that. So, kind of another constituency that can have some frustration as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, again, for those small, medium businesses where we're 75 people in our organization, a little bit less. There's a lot of tight integration with that, but sometimes in bigger organizations there isn't, and that's a new area that you have to really talk to. It's not our typical area of expertise or group of folks that we talk to within the security industry. So sometimes even just breaking those bounds are a little bit difficult. So yeah, we're past the hype now. So in this hype curve where you talk about things, they get a lot of publicity and they really ramp up. 2013 survey, so 6 years ago, they found that, again, just these things were important, but probably not as many people really put a lot of effort in it until, again, seems like more this year. Defining third-party risk management responsibility. Who's responsible? We'll talk a little bit about that. How do you standardize? Some of the fits and starts there. What kind of tools? They're looking at what tools you can use to support those. And then really, how do you really influence those third-party controls and communicate with them? What can you do actually when they're non-compliant, and how far are you willing to take it? 54% of organizations, again, by Ponemon, just this year, say that data from third-party assessments is only somewhat valuable, and only 8% of assessments result in any action. So again, when you're filling out these assessments, 8% of the time, it's going to cause a change in business or a change in your relationship. So we already know why. Why these third parties can cause, are really picking up now. Certainly data breaches, that's been in the news, and we'll talk about a few of those. Reputation damage, regulatory compliance, but really probably the last one is newer to a lot of us, which is disruptions to the supply chain. Your customers, those even, those fourth party that our customers are asking us for. What are they, looking to do? There was this year, the American Medical Collection Agency. So it was a collection agency for billing services for large healthcare organizations. They had a breach. They had, clients such as Quest, LabCorp, BioReference Laboratories, et cetera. So they hold a lot of patients' most sensitive data. They had an incident, and their 4 largest clients ceased operations with them. So it's hitting us, and a lot of times these costs can easily pass $1 million. And again, to Alex's point, it's hitting sales. And
I think another point with that too, it's always important to note, is when you think of some of the large breaches that have been in the news, whether it's Delta or LabCorp or Target's the one people like to talk about. Everybody knows the organization that had the issue, but they can't name that third party that it came through. So it really is your reputation on the line, damage to your organization. Another thing that, we're seeing a lot more of too is, when you talk about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability oftentimes seems to get short shrift with a lot of these things. And so a lot of these vendors can very much, or these third parties can very much affect your availability and your ability to do business. And we'll talk a bit about kind of how to rank criticality of vendors and third parties. But that's something that's extremely important to note. Are there vendors out there that you cannot do business if their service is not available?
That's great. So just a couple of things, that I've gotten that I would call interesting requests or a little bit unusual. So sometimes, you need to be prepared for these. And if you're the ones asking these, maybe rethink them when they go through. But a couple examples of questions I've been asked this year is, can you provide us with the SOC 2s for all of our vendors? So every single one, they wanted us to collect every single SOC 2 for those vendors, which, again, they're vendors. One wanted us to provide attestation of where Microsoft stores its data. So even though for Office 365, they were an Office 365 client and we were too, we had to get an attestation from Microsoft on where it stores its data and was it, here in North America, et cetera. Someone wanted a picture of someone signing in and out of the building to show that we were compliant with our own practices. We had to do screenshots of the entire system access process, that type of thing. And then lastly, probably the wanted us to share responsibility in their compliance for some of the things we do, and their remediation when of course, we can't do that because we don't have ability to affect what they remediate from our assessments. The other thing I'm seeing a lot of is, when these applications that people are using, one time the application was broken, sent them a note, never heard back. And then all of a sudden we got, our salesperson back to that, got a notification that we're past due and they were going to be ceasing business with us if we didn't sign it. So a lot of times, one hand doesn't know what the other is doing. So I guess the summary of this is just kind of be prepared that there's some crazy things that might be coming your way in some of these requests.
And I think to some degree, Steve, that's also a function of, whether it's framework standards or whatever's being used. Oftentimes it's looking at to be a one size fits all. So a way to assess all your third parties or vendors and not being specifically focused on what service they're providing or the size of the organization or the risk. So if you're not assessing vendors by risk, you may be sending everybody the same questionnaire or performing the same assessment, and it may not be focused in the way it needs to be. And oftentimes, people that are tasked with these vendor assessments are, they might not have a background in security or operations and may not understand compensating controls as well or other things like that. My favorite request, around the world is seeing people ask for things that would violate policy to share. So, in my life, I've requested policies a number of times that, very clearly say they could not be shared outside the organization, and there wasn't any kind of provision in there for exception to that. So it's always interesting as someone that does assessments and audits just to see, by sharing that, you're violating your own policy. So it's an interesting aside.
All right, so let's get into a little bit, you talk about governance quite often. Who should be responsible? There's numerous parties, again, that we talked about that need to be involved. Where's the accountability for this, for protecting the information resources, where it sits within the enterprise, both from if you're doing your own third-party vendor risk assessments, and then if you're responding to them?
So what's interesting is where it often falls is to whoever has the free time or whoever, has traditionally, been able to get these done. It's kind of like I always tell people that are starting out in business, never tell people you're good at Excel, because they'll ask you for every, Excel question in the world. And kind of similarly, a lot of times these in small organizations will fall to, kind of whoever is available. And a number of times, you'll see people that, answer them in good faith and there's no malice, but they're incorrect. And, one of the methods that I've used, there's an organization that I do a lot of vendor risk assessments for, is coming up with more open-ended questions that aren't necessarily designed to elicit a yes or no, but really to ascertain whether the person answering the question even understands the question and why it's being asked, to kind of leave it open-ended on that end. And it's very often that, we come across people that don't even necessarily understand the intent of the question or the spirit. And so really, it's as far as who's responsible, in every organization, it seems to be a little bit different. And if you're looking at both sides of the table, for the vendor, it's oftentimes is the salesperson. And they're, required to, go get those answers or answer them the best they can.
So this sort of first line of defense might be, who owns the risk? And a lot of times that just isn't even defined within an organization. So who are the risk owners? And so, from our, within our purvey of security and compliance and what we have to do, that understanding who owns that risk, what are our risk tolerances, things like that. A lot of times that hasn't been defined. And this, having these third-party assessments might really push you to do that because it's so critical. It really sets everything else up. Okay. Our first, thing that we always would try to do is just answer yes to every single question. What we're seeing, and maybe you have more, go and touching on a little bit of what you talked about, Alex, was you can't do this as easily anymore. We'll still probably all default to that, just say, yes, we do everything and hope it goes away. And sometimes it does. Sometimes it still sits. But what I'm seeing a lot of is customers are really, or companies, our assessors are really looking for evidence of that compliance. So similarly, they're looking almost, it's not just, hey, do you have this stuff, but show it to us. Give us examples. I gave some of the examples before. They want to see screenshots. They want to see, attestations. They want to see, numerous different things from it. So it's not just as easy to say yes anymore.
And part of it comes down to the veracity of the assessment. And because it's very common to see that, organizations, even large organizations, have very few people devoted to assessing third parties. So they're not necessarily covering all the third parties that they should, or really understanding what's being shared or how that's operating. I always push for a more cooperative relationship, and it's not always easy to do. But if you approach it, as somebody buying services with the idea that, hey, we're not trying to go through this to, kick you out of contention for a deal. We're going through it to be better partners, and so we can all work together better. And if you approach it that way, there's oftentimes you get much better answers out of it, a much better relationship. And it certainly is. There's a compulsion of people just to say yes, because a lot of times these feel like a test to get the business. And if you're a salesperson or your organization that wants the business, it's very easy to push towards saying yes. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times when people just say yes, it's not out of malice. It's not purposely misleading or dishonest. They honestly believe that answer. And, so from my perspective, when I'm looking at an organization as a third party, if it's one of these critical vendors, you really need to do a lot more. Sending out a self-reported, answer sheet and asking for some screenshots isn't going to cover you as well as, you probably need, when it's a critical vendor. You really need to, be going out there and actually assessing them.
Excellent. And just a quick sidebar, wanted to mention, questions, feel free to send them across. We're going to continue on with the webinar, but then definitely make sure that we answer them all at the end. So keep them coming, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Okay, standardization. Alex, you've talked about this a lot before, is, where has it been tried? Why can't we just standardize to one particular thing, like a shared assessments, information gathering? How has that fared in the past? What lessons have you seen if we just say, as an industry or as the security industry, why can't we just standardize to one particular, way of doing this?
I think part of it is every organization, does something a little bit differently and has different needs and expectations and requirements, and may use the service a little bit differently. There have been a number of times that, standardization has been attempted. I know there have been some efforts in, certain industries and financial industries and some others to be able to use, one assessment. And it's kind of like, hey, if we paid a third party to go out and assess company Y, we'll all agree to accept that assessment. And while that certainly happens, in certain cases, it still tends to be that organizations are assessing, their third parties themselves. I don't know if it's necessarily an issue of trust or something like that. It's kind of like, if you're buying a used car, you want to see it before you buy it, but you might not necessarily, trust your friend who's not a mechanic who went out and, kicked the tires a couple times. So I think that there's part of that. There have been times, I think it was, actually, we probably worked on it together about 10 years ago. There was a push from certain financial institutions where wanted to require everybody to get a 27001 registration in order to do business with them. And, way back then, I mean, there were very few. So you could almost, count them on two hands. The number of companies in the U.S. that had that ISO registration. And, so I used to see that a lot more, where it was kind of like, hey, either send us your ISO 27001 registration or answer this, 100-page spreadsheet. And that still is happening. You see organizations that will accept a SOC 2 or something like that in lieu of some of the other things. But oftentimes now it's more additive. It's hey, show me your SOC 2 or other assessments you've had in addition to answering these questions or doing these other things.
Yep, that's exactly what we've seen. That kind of leads into our next point, which is, if we're going to, a lot of folks have been having assessments, obviously, for, quite a few years, and we do a ton of them to various standards. Should you be looking at just having an assessment or moving towards attestation? Some of these, obviously, we have certification for SOC 2 or PCI, for example. But, what about some of these other ones? Where do you see, this moving to, or where the industry or where, quite frankly, we should be moving towards?
So there's certainly standards that, are widely accepted, and that they are something that you can receive a certification or, a piece of paper, like 27001. But a lot of the other ones, are more that you can show that you've had an assessment performed. But then it comes down to really, do I trust whomever did the assessment? Because, anybody can, kind of put a sign out in front of a storefront and kind of go out and do some of these assessments. And so, if you're relying on one of these, you really need to make sure that you trust the assessor, trust the organization doing the assessment, and that you're getting, kind of the detail. One of the things that's really important when you're looking at assessment that's been done by a third party is making sure that you're looking at their methodology, seeing their work paper, seeing the evidence, seeing how they're actually doing this. The other thing is scoping, so, somebody might, have a lot of really good processes, but those processes aren't necessarily covering the service that you are using specifically, from your third party.
Yeah, and and just even this attestation, I think probably NIST CSF is starting to, the cybersecurity framework is picking up. Certainly SOC 2, there's a lot of inquiries about that. ISO is still pretty intensive, and most organizations don't want to get to that level. But other factors to look at is, for example, do you have government customers, and are they pushing more towards a standard, for example, or is there some other, can you use PCI? If you have to be PCI compliant anyway, could you start with that with some of these vendors? So everything that we're looking to do is, how can you reduce this burden? If you're already doing something, oftentimes that will allow you to work or get through some of these assessments. And then if you're sending these out or getting your questionnaires out, it's a determination of, do you want to accept an attestation? And so, maybe it is, you don't know if it's a trusted third party that's attesting to it, but either way, at least someone has put their name on it, and that might suffice for your, quote unquote, risk appetite for some of the third party vendors that you have, depending on where they lie. So creating, better partnerships. How do how can you minimize risk based on these relationships?
So again, to me, it's very important to have good relationships, in business and really in everything that we do. And the fact of the matter is, sending out a questionnaire and, having very little contact otherwise, a very rigid questionnaire is not necessarily the way to build relationships. I mean, it might be a good methodology to use if you're only looking at very specific and measurable controls. But oftentimes, just making sure that you're creating that environment, making sure that you create the understanding that, the goal of the third-party assessment is not to discount you from doing business, although there certainly are times where that's appropriate. Mm-hmm. But really to create that partnership, call me idealistic, but I wish there was more information sharing, within the industry and expertise. And so if you're going to work with somebody else, we've certainly done this. We had a client that asked us to talk to one of their vendors, and we were more than happy to do that. And we ended up talking to their vendor, and there were a lot of concerns, some what we might even call cyber hygiene type stuff that just wasn't being done appropriately. And what we were able to do is kind of walk them through and provide some guidance on the call. And, and actually we had a couple follow-up calls kind of as a courtesy to tell them how we'd like to see things done, what the best practices were. And they were able to implement that stuff. And it's kind of a funny story because this vendor that one of our customers was looking at actually was able to use their new processes that we kind of helped implement to go after bigger customers, because it kind of helped them change some of their processes. So it really is a good example. It's, if a vendor provides a great service that can be very valuable to your business processes, and they're not quite where they need to be on security, and you can offer them some help or some guidance, go ahead and do it. I know that doesn't work in every situation. Right. I'm not that idealistic, but really it does come down to being able to create a good relationship. not just, being a amorphous, email address that's mailing out, random questions and things like that.
It's a good point, because one of the ways to, in essence, pitch this to the salespeople, or to get budget for this, as an example, because again, that starts coming in to play. But when you have your key partners, and I put this Duncan Hines difference in, there's an old story of, back when everyone was baking their own cakes from scratch. Duncan Hines came out with a mix that basically all you had to do was add water. And as it turned out, it didn't sell very well. So what they decided or found, that if you did everything for them, they weren't that interested. So people liked it better, and they became much more engaged when they, added their own ingredients, when they added their own eggs. They felt that they were more part of the process. And again, it's not going to be for every single one that you're doing this, that you're integrating. But, a lot of times is, a lot of the advice that we get within security is, get out of security, get out of IT, get to the business, get to the business. This might be one of those ways where, again, not for every single one, but, your key partners, maybe there's only one or two of them, or maybe, there's a few where you really, rely significantly on them for your business, especially now going forward, where more and more is getting outsourced and that type of thing. That might be worthwhile doing. And again, it not only brings the customer closer, and, but it improves your partnership internally with your, chief of sales and things like that. So then you have more people other than just you or the CISO or CIO or, someone in IT, touting your story, that there's other, areas. And a lot of times they don't even realize the burden that it is on you, all the things that you have to do.
And I think one thing to mention too, just as we're going through this, is that, certainly the themes or, the spirit of a lot of things that we're saying, may apply always. But the fact of the matter is, if you are an organization with 10 employees, your vendor management programs can be very different than, a company with 50,000 employees. So really, trying to get some of these best practices in there, might be easier for some than others. And every size organization has its own challenge.
So one of the ideas, just a sidebar, one of the ideas out there is about continuous monitoring of third parties. So having this, so you're not just doing a one-time audit, it's continual. PCI went down this path for, internally, but with your vendors, so they would upload something new when it new when it happens, if they have a new, pen test or validation or what have you. What do you see within the challenges of that? Is, think that's going to take off? Again, not for everyone, but maybe for those key ones?
It depends. And, one thing is that it's in some ways it's easier to test the technical compliance over time. So, what are your scans or pen tests? How are they changing, over the life of the contract? Versus, changes to the program itself and the governance and things like that can be tougher to, gather evidence for on an ongoing basis. But I think that also brings up the point of, action plan. So, there are a number of times that maybe the vendor's not quite where you need them to be, but they submit an action plan. And, one of the things that I'll see is those fall off. So, hey, you got everything signed, and then nothing ever comes with the action plan. So, especially for those where there's remediation necessary, is making sure that you're continuously checking in on the progress and making sure that things are getting where they need to be.
Right. It's still a burden, though, on the on this little security team or audit, if you have it. If you're large enough to have an audit team that handles these, again, maybe it's different, but probably I'm, guessing most of us, it's just, they're like, well, that's a security function. We don't really have an internal audit, et cetera. So it falls back there.
And I think that's one thing that's important too, because you mentioned it being a burden is, there are a lot of, nobody has 100 hours in a week to do these things. And so, how do we spend our time? And I think one of the things is that, when you look at a lot of security programs, vendor management's not something that necessarily receives the amount of time and resources that it should, given how important it is from multiple aspects, but also given, how much a part third parties have been in a lot of the incidents that we've seen. So it's really, even though it is a burden, you need to devote the resources.
Yeah. So sharing data. Again, something you talk about a lot when you begin assessments, but, is there a way to start maybe cutting down or paring down the burden that you have? So if you don't have their data, for example, or if you're not sharing that data, how do you go about, maybe helping organizations with this in this area?
Sorry. So that's a great question. I did not set that up actually, but I think it comes down to, we talk a lot about risk-based security, and there's a million things that any company could be doing, but we don't have time to do them all. So what are the most important ones? How do we prioritize?
Yep.
And vendor management's no different. It's, the way I look at a vendor management program is, anybody that's a third party that's, dealing with the organization should go into the program. Now, a lot of them will be kicked out right away, kicked out of the flow chart because they're not doing anything that's going to affect things. And obviously it requires you to really understand your own organization, where the data is, who's accessing it, what your data flows look like, what your risk profile looks like. But then from there, really understanding what the third party is going to have access to. And, if they have access to your data, whether, they can come in and get it, or, you're sending it out, or, access to your network, or, if they provide a service that's, essential to your business functioning, something that, you can't stay up and running if they're not there. And, different degrees of that, but then prioritizing your vendors or your third parties based on the risk they pose and, the information that they have. And then from there, because you're not going to go out and do the exact same vendor assessment on, a critical vendor that has all your data and, somebody that's, selling you cakes for parties, someone that sells you cakes is technically a vendor, but they wouldn't get very far along that, vendor flow chart. So really making sure that you're understanding your most important vendors so that you can spend your limited time and resources on assessment and monitoring of those vendors is going to be essential.
And so when you flow this out, I think, what we've seen, again, this, things jump up on you in third-party assessments. Probably a lot of us hadn't been ready for it. But when we go back in time or now start looking at, all right, how do we start this program from the beginning if we, since particularly, probably planning for next year, things that I think that I'm seeing is the more preparation we can do in the beginning to eliminate vendors or stop, taking data that we don't need. So, when we go through it and the sharing data, who has what and what information do we have, what services are we providing? So, for example, at Trusted Sec, we do not store or transmit or process any customer information. So just that alone sometimes eliminates some of the questions. Where, who has access to it, that type of thing. What are the vendor doing with the information if you're looking for them? Why do they have it? Again, some of these things are challenging, but more challenging in the beginning because you have to think through it and it's almost, an internal process in and of itself for you. But it does save a lot of time. And again, these things are going to just keep coming from what we're seeing and hearing. And again, even from our assessments and the regulations and all that stuff is you have to know what your vendors are doing. So the more and more you get ahead of this game, and a lot of us don't really know what those are, particularly in the bigger companies. We have so many vendors and we have so many customers as an example. But where is this, data of information processed and stored? How will you get it that's another thing that comes up, and we'll talk about controls in a second here, but how will that data get to the vendor? And then again, any subcontractors that they're using or we would be using, make sure that you understand that and be prepared to answer that so that, you're really cutting down your data management tasks in what you do. Okay, so what are some of the more important controls? So if we had to focus on, some of the things, and I'll start with the first one that we get a lot. All right, if we're going to, prioritize our tasks and things that we need to do, certainly the first and foremost thing that we get asked for is, do you have policies? And so that is definitely an important control to have. Almost everyone will want to see that. And then from there, really what I've seen is, and I think a good way to go about it, especially again, when you're developing these relationships or talking or filling out these assessments, is a lot of times they're looking for the hygiene efforts, as you talked about a little bit, Alex, before. So patching, passwords, access control lists, privilege account management, that actually comes up quite a bit. So, if you haven't looked at that, that's something, obviously pen test scans, but logging, having host-based firewalls, backups, that type of thing. What do you see that coming down the pike, or, where would you suggest, what are the more important controls to really focus on?
Well, so if I can just back up a little bit and give the consulting answer, which is that it depends, right? Yep. And the fact of the matter is, what controls are most important depends on what the vendor's doing or what you're doing for the client or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. And again, the challenge is to bolt in kind of what you might consider a best practice, use that overused word, vendor management program, without understanding first your own processes and your own data and the risk to that and your own risk tolerance and everything else. Because again, vendor management needs to be an element of an information security program. Mm-hmm. It can't sit on its own. You can't just take a list of best practices and ask your vendors if they're doing them without really understanding what the vendor's doing for you. So a lot of the most important controls when assessing your third parties are really on your own end. So really understanding what you have, what you're using. It's become more challenging, as everything's changed. And it used to be that you could get a pretty good, idea of your vendors from accounting, because everyone's getting paid. But now there's a lot of open source stuff and free mm-hmm. stuff people are using, and we don't necessarily have a really good idea of where their data is or what's happening to it. So I think to that end, the most important questions to ask are not just what controls are around the data, but get a better scope first. So what data are they going to have? How are they going to use it? And then that starts to allow you to figure out what controls need to be put around the relationship.
I would say from my perspective, the ones that I mentioned are the ones that I'm seeing. We're getting a lot of, and to your point, we really do get a lot of one size fits all. They're just jamming a bunch of questions at us, and so for those who have to fill them out, just again, those are the top things I'm seeing. Just a couple more, thinking about it is, how are you removing data? Do you have an IR plan? That seems to be a big one, and then lastly, probably security awareness.
Right. And the legal stuff too. So,
sure.
Service level agreements, but also,
yep.
Notification requirements.
Yep.
So what do the notification requirements actually mean? So what what is an indicator that would trigger notification of something? And
yep.
There's a lot of conversation around that and stuff like that. And I know that we've kind of been jumping around talking about kind of both sides of the table. But I think that's important to do so that, you can kind of see it from both sides and why these things end up being asked. But again, I think it comes down to that just basic, just understanding what the relationship entails, what's moving around, and that kind of thing. When I used to fill these out, I spent a lot of time doing it, is that, the problem is I don't know how they managed to do it, but every organization asks the same question slightly different. So you can't use the exact same answer.
Right.
I mean, and that's not true of everyone, but I don't really know how they do it. It must be a class. They must take a class somewhere on how to write questions in a way that you can't reuse your answers.
Right.
But yeah, it's tough. Yeah.
It's 5% of the questions. I don't even know what they're asking. It's like, what did they mean by this? And you have to go back. And a lot of times, again, you're asking the auditor and they don't know. So you will get a lot of that. There's other things that we're seeing is, do they have the right to audit us in their contracts? Similarly for you, if you're putting them out there, if there are a lot of old contracts out there, do you have the right to audit? And even if you don't use it, maybe, start looking at some of this verbiage and seeing if you can include it in your contracts. Again, you're getting out of the security norm a little bit. If you're there, but if you needed to audit someone to make sure that they understand that you could come, we are seeing this. So here's just some sample verbiage. Again, will be available afterwards if you need to do it. You're also seeing a little on cyber liability insurance. Certainly for us, people ask it. Have you seen or do you do a lot of recommendations, or where do you see most of the organizations that you assess with that area, and does it help at all with any of the third-party assessments?
It absolutely does when they want you to have it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's so, because I gave a presentation a few years ago. I actually talked to Mick Douglas, who a lot of people know, and kind of asked him what he thought the three biggest threats were to organizations. And one of his three biggest was regulators and insurers. And the reason he said insurers is because a lot of times you're required by contract to have insurance, and you have no control over how much it's going to cost or what has to be covered. So it's just kind of an interesting take. And so, cyber insurance is certainly a tool in the arsenal, but it's not the silver bullet that people seem to think it is. it's good to have life insurance. That doesn't mean I'm going to go drive 200 miles an hour on the way home. You still want to make sure you're doing the right things, and it's there, oftentimes now to help after an incident. They provide forensic services or breach coverage, whatever it may be. But so, liability insurance is certainly something, cyber liability insurance is certainly something that, a lot of people are asking for, and, it has its purpose, but it's certainly not a substitute for a security program.
Gotcha. Okay, so what if we just wanted to outsource this? Can we just push this off to someone else, go to management and say, hey, we need someone else to manage our third-party vendors? Have you seen this very much? I can say from our side, but, what have you seen out there?
Absolutely. In the interest of full disclosure, it's a service that we provide. I mean, I go out and do a lot of vendor assessments. So just know that, when I get my answer. So, obviously I think it's valuable.
But not the vendor management program, or you're
either or, but actually going out and doing site visits and things like that. And it can make sense. Keep in mind that sometimes when things are outsourced, it's people are looking for a standardized process that they can take and just apply to vendors. So it really depends on, how you're outsourcing it. So are you, for your critical vendors, actually getting a trusted partner to go out there and actually perform a full, assessment or audit, of the vendor? Versus, are you just having somebody manage your vendor management program with spreadsheets and things like that? So there are different ways to look at the outsourcing. It's certainly something that we're seeing more commonly. It's one of the things that, with larger contracts, a customer may even request, hey, you have to pay for this firm or someone from this list of firms to come out and assess you before we'll do business with you. And we can see the results of that. So it's certainly growing. A lot of times it's a budget concern, being able to pay a third-party assessor to go out and perform, multiple assessments of your customers or potential customers can cost some money. But it's definitely a trend that's been picking up.
And then, what about, one of the things on this third parties as well is the challenge with it is that they're not going to really do the whole life cycle we've seen. Like, they're not going to be able to do your contract management and, your financial management and, what issues and disputes, what happens there. Certainly your governance and different layers of integration within it. So I think there's a lot of areas that they just really, you can't just easily outsource. You can, right, as you said, have someone help you with, going out and doing them on site if you do that. But in a lot of times, you just can't quite outsource this whole thing to anyone, even internally outsourced. Getting back to that partnership where we've seen, hey, we just sent this off to audit. We haven't really been seeing that works very well either.
Well, and I think, Steve, too, it comes down to the fact that, as we discussed earlier, vendor management is part of an information security program. It doesn't necessarily stand on its own. And so once you have the program working really well, you can look at, the parts of the program that you could outsource or could use help with. But until you get there, it's kind of tough just to say, here's my 20 vendors, go check them out.
Yep. Now, what about automation and tools? I'll tell you from my side on the various tools that we have to fill out. I mean, certainly the idea of a tool, if you're, for your third parties, makes a lot of sense versus just spreadsheets and, helps you organize it. But I'll tell you, from filling them out, I have not seen them really be all that valuable to the organization. I mean, again, from a time savings it is, but really from answering the questions, it really, I've seen a lot of challenges with the tools as someone who has to fill them out. There's been issues. They don't update correctly. They don't save. So it really puts a huge burden on me as the person that fill it out. But from your side, or from that third party side, as you're trying to, delve out to the other, your vendors, any tools in particular that you've seen well, or just that whole category, anything that you've seen overall?
Well, maybe because I'm getting older, but I'm not huge on tools for a lot of this stuff. For a few reasons. One, there are two ways to look at it. One is, the idea of using a tool from a process standpoint versus the actual tools that are out there. And, you see a bunch of issues with them. And, what's worse than, using one of these, sites that you fill out, you put all your answers in and then press submit and the page dies.
Right.
But really, it comes down to a lot of these things are fairly nuanced. And again, there are controls that can be measured, in a binary way. It either exists or it doesn't. But a lot of times it comes down to compensating controls or other things. We talk about, the locked doors. If the standard requires a locked door and you don't have a locked door, but you have cameras and an armed guard 24 hours a day and attack dogs and a moat and everything else, well, there's no lock on the door, so you fail.
Right.
So, really, it's always going to be, some degree of human element, especially. But as far as collecting information, the tools can be helpful.
And so if you don't want to have, again, you're trying to minimize your work and you don't want to have just a one size fits all for all your vendors, how many assessments, how many sheets, or should you say, how many numbers of question sets should you have?
Oh, that's tough. That's a tough question. But, the way I like to do it when I put together these programs is to have, a base set of things to be assessed. And then have modules. So, okay, if they're developing software for us, we're going to use that base assessment, but also add these reviews or these types of things for a software developer, or for whatever they may be providing. So I think it depends. It really depends on what kind of vendors you're using. Some places, most stuff's in-house. Some places outsource just about everything. And so it really comes down to different situations require a different program.
Yeah, I think we've tried to, just get what are those core vendors that we have and maybe, have just a more significant subset of, or significant question set. And then if we are going down to the medium and lows, which we'll talk about in a second.
But you got to, but first you have to define what makes a vendor critical. And,
exactly.
and, maybe you have 3 critical vendors, maybe you have 70.
Yep.
And so the answer depends. Is that if you have 3 critical vendors, then you need to assess those 3 for sure. If you have 70, you got to do 70.
Yeah.
So it depends on the situation.
All right. Moving into, what things are out there that can help us that are free. And so the shared assessments, they have a standardized information gathering, and this is a free assessment where they go down your vendor risk management maturity levels. And you can walk through this as, pretty much any other maturity level that you have and really self-assess where you are without very much difficulty. They've laid it out pretty well. So, again, we'll include the area or include the link underneath this, but, they've laid out those categories pretty well in the way, hey, what level are we? And so some of that, and maybe we'll walk through the different areas of each one and kind of what they touch on. But, within these categories, again, what I like about it is, if we need to go get budget and we need to just let someone know, here's where we are, you can have a third party do this, certainly, to attest to it or to, again, sometimes you can't say it yourself, but it's a pretty simple way to go about, giving yourself status. So the first one is program governance. From this, are you, seeing, and again, you talk a lot about governance, you're seeing that these things are well defined, or where would you, put most organizations you see from, small, large, and in governance?
As far as where I would rank them?
Yeah, where they rank them.
It's all over the place. I mean, it really is. I always say there's nothing that surprises me anymore these days. But it's something that, it's getting more traction. But I think it's something that a lot of organizations struggle with, is that governance piece. So why are you doing what you're doing, and, what's actually driving it, as opposed to just going out and putting in a list of controls.
So then some of the basics, again, are how well are you have policies and standards. Again, something outside of traditional security is contract development. Who's managing this contracts? Are you adhering to it? And is management involved?
And I think especially with policies, because you could have the best policies in the world, but nobody follows them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's still certainly the number one thing.
Absolutely. But it's one of the things that I think that one of the things that vendor assessments oftentimes miss is there's a difference between existence and effectiveness.
Right.
So just because something exists doesn't mean it's effective. I like to use the treadmill example. And, I don't use the treadmill as the kind of, InfoSec as a never-ending grind until one day you hopefully retire. But really, if somebody goes out and buys a treadmill and plops it down, in front of their TV in the living room, are they suddenly in shape?
Yep.
I mean, no. I mean, the tool exists there, but it really, if they're not using it appropriately, if it's not part of a program and things like that. So one thing just to keep in mind as you're assessing vendors, or even if you're being assessed, is look at the difference between the existence of a control and whether or not it's effective. You know, there's a big difference.
And I think that builds on the skills and expertise. Do you have that, that skill and expertise? And then, another category they have here, which is the tools, measurement, and analysis. How are you measuring, what you have in place? And so, that will give you a better understanding of, all right, how much money are we looking to invest in this, if we can measure it in any way, shape, or form. And then lastly is a monitoring review. So risk ranking your vendors, generally, how can you sort the vendors? And, by type of data, typically is what we get asked. What data would we have if they deem us critical or not? A lot of times based on what we do, we can get ourselves in essence removed from a critical vendor, so to speak. What data do we have access to? Could it be amount of business they handle? How core to your business they are? How do you see? And again, more in a simple way. If you don't have a tremendous amount of time to risk rank all of it.
And again, it kind of goes back to, you have to understand your own organization before you can understand, what your vendors, can affect. And, I know that sometimes it goes down to dollars, and hey, if it's a contract over $200,000, they have to get this happening or whatever it is. But when you start to get into information, especially, is you may have a low dollar vendor that provides some kind of app or service or whatever it may be that has a ton of access to your network, or they have a ton of data, and maybe you're not spending a ton of money with them, and there might be other vendors that you spend a lot of money with, and it looks like they have their data, but you're just sending your marketing sheets off to them to be printed, so that's public anyway. So everything has to be in context, and it comes down to, first off, as I said, understanding your own business, what data is important, what's critical, what matters. And then, but really it kind of, as I said, if they can affect your ability to do business, to stay open from an availability standpoint, do they have access into your systems and network, or, are you sharing critical or data with them? And those are kind of the big ones. Basic. I mean, there's some others. Because again, I always like to qualify that, things may be different based on your organization, but those are usually the major ones.
Yeah, those are good. Those are good basic ones. So building out a vendor assessment program, walk us through if you had, some core recommendations or where to start, walk us through how you go about that.
So first, again, it goes back to knowing what you have and understanding your own business, your own data flows, your own business processes, and then understanding where the vendors hook into those or affect them in any way. Also looking at compliance and legal concerns, people can affect things like that. So of course, if it's something that, there's a breach notification requirements or things like that from the data they may have, making sure that you're involving your legal team, and really just you got to start with getting a list of your actual vendors, and then kind of coming together and coming up with a way to rank those and rate those, and really just understand what data they have and the importance of that data and the connections. And then from there, making a risk decision on, what's the veracity of the assessment. We like to say that we can't make anybody do anything, but we want you to understand the risk of what you're doing and then make an informed choice. So making sure that whoever in the organization understands the risk and then makes a decision based on that. Making sure that the decisions are being made at the right level of the organization. You don't want somebody, that has a less responsible role, maybe making a major risk decision for the organization. And then from there, determining, what kind of resources do you have or should you have to perform these assessments and who should be doing them. And then defining the processes. So is it going to be, where everybody gets a questionnaire at a certain level, and then either based on the answer to those questionnaires, we may go out and do a further assessment either by the phone or with additional questionnaires, or we're going to actually go out there and visit them and get into it. Are you going to have a way to do a corrective action plan? So if a vendor you really want to use isn't where they need to be, they're going to provide you with their plans to remediate and constant updates and things like that.
So this question I want to get into, because for me, when you can push back. So when you've done, gone out for those organizations, when are you able to push back? Because I do push back some, but it doesn't always work. But what happens when you find a nonconformity as an example?
It's-
What types of things? Again, just on the ones that you've been on.
It's 100% relationship based. So it depends who you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with somebody, if you're picturing somebody kind of, stuck in a cubicle, just, looking for yes or no's, checks, either you have the control or you don't, it's going to be harder to push back on that. Versus if there's more of a relationship, as we talk about the compensating control. So no, you don't have this control, but we have these other things in place and they're willing to, do a risk acceptance around that or something like that. Yep. When it comes to being assessed, I always tell people, look, if it's easy to get a check mark, just do it.
Sure.
Right. I mean, even if you think it doesn't matter, if they're looking for you to have that check mark, go ahead and just put it in place and be done with it rather than have to explain it. Mm-hmm. But if it's tough to get that check mark, then, if you have compensating controls, then put a case together. But really, it depends on the relationship. If you're providing a service that there are 100 other companies that provide the exact same service at the exact same price, and you can't say yes to that question and the rest can, then you really don't have room to push back. Yeah. If you're trying to engage a large company, I mean, there are a couple out there that are very famous for it. There's one story people love to tell about a very large company that was trying to sell to, I think it was a branch of the military, and wouldn't meet the conditions, and they just said no thanks. So it really it depends. It depends on the relationship. It depends on the service. It depends on the situation.
So, we only have a couple minutes left, responding to these third-party vendor risk assessments and lessons learned. So, for me, it's definitely coming to terms with it. And that's just not me as a person, but me as us as the organization, that these things are getting bigger. And a lot of times they jump up on us. Another thing, to make sure you're alerting the execs and management that it's a larger effort every year. I don't think most organizations or most executives would really think about it, even within risk organizations, about how much time this actually takes. We do look at, when we're looking to answer them, what are the basic set of questions that we can just have a, standard answer to for our industry. And sometimes just having that, we get, again, we've gotten the SIG, so we filled that out, and sometimes we just send that along. I know it's costs if you're going to use it on your own, but we've been able to just take one and say, all right, we're going to fill these out. But without question, you have to keep a library of all the other answers. And there's, for me, just doing this in a spreadsheet is probably best, and trying to categorize them, because as you said earlier, most every vendor still wants you to fill out their form. No matter what we do, no matter what I try to streamline, they're still going to ask their own set of questions. And even if they have a similar set, make sure you have validation, because we're getting a lot. Again, we can't just say yes to everything. People are asking for validation. And then lastly, open the lines of communication outside of security. So, in that, last couple of minutes, that moving to a standard, what do you see there? And is anything you would, recommend, and how we would go about choosing one or addressing it? And then we'll get to a few.
The evidence, and have I, maintained it, that if I were questioned on my response to this, that I can, show it and answer it effectively.
Yep. Perfect. Okay, great. Couple of questions that we have, and we'll get to it now. Let's walk through these. I think we touched on this, but if an organization is assessing their third parties, should you tailor the questionnaire, or sending an all-inclusive questionnaire and then scaling it down from there? What do you see as the best approach?
So again, the consultant answers, of course, it depends, but it depends on how much your, how customized your program is, how much staff you have, how much time you have to do these things. And again, I think to that end, that's when it comes down to having a really good list of basic questions that go to everybody, and then having custom questions that might go to somebody deemed, a higher critical risk, or, a certain type of, like a software developer or whatever it may be. Obviously, if you can, have a specific assessments per vendor. If you have, a certain subset of vendors, it's that important that you can spend that time. that would be great. But for most organizations, that's not feasible.
And we'll just get to a couple more since we only have a few minutes. Again, getting to this, we receive a few hundred questionnaires a year. So it's, you can't just automate with tools. But, for me, again, if I try to send them first a subset of questions, then I use the shared assessment, the SIG. If that works, a lot of times it doesn't. And I don't really have a good answer if you're getting hundreds of questionnaires, because again, each one we have to fill out on their system with their particular nuances.
Well, and the answer is like anything else. It's in the long term, lobby to figure out a way to get that down and look for some kind of shared group or shared assessment. But in the meantime, it's like any other capacity issue. If you have one person to fill out 500 questionnaires a year and there's no way to get out of filling those out, you probably need to increase capacity. And, and looking at it as a business, that's part of the sales process, or that's part of the delivery process, is filling these out. Then you have to account for that and have to be able to meet that capacity.
And one last one, we'll finish up here. What are your thoughts on CASB solutions, cloud access security brokers? Where does the cloud come in to it?
So that's interesting. And one of the things with the cloud is because, things have moved there so rapidly. And there are a lot of things out there that if you look at them, the biggest issues that we see are, around access management. So even if the cloud solution may be secure, people aren't necessarily using the controls provided. So it's, your house might, or your hotel room might come with a bunch of locks on the door, but if you're not using them, it doesn't matter in the end. So, with cloud, it can be more challenging to get them to answer questions or things like that. It's making sure that you're going with, known resources. I say it kind of jokingly, but there's certain vendors that are so large that everyone's using them, that if they have an issue, at least you're in good company that, a ton of other companies are having the exact same issue that use that cloud vendor.
And it's just about how you use it. Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone so much for joining us today. Thank you, Alex, for joining me in talking about this. And again, we're always here to ask any other further questions, anything that we didn't get to, or any other ways that you want to go about it. Again, this will be posted on our site, and you'll get a follow-up email with it. And if there's anything else that we can do for you, please just let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Have a great day.